The next step on my decan journey is Gemini 1, the first decan of Gemini. Gemini energy is fast and quick. It's about multiplicity of perspective. Gemini is an air sign ruled by Mercury, and it's got a mutable quality. Its symbol is the twins. So, Gemini can be about gathering information and putting it out in the world as part of the energy. Mercury is a sign of the trickster. So, there's also a flexibility of perspective or understanding multiple things can be true at once, or even grappling with multiple perspectives can be part of the Gemini energy. Also, somewhat grappling with questions of light and dark. This comes from the twins symbology. Ancient mythology around twins often has a story of two brothers or two siblings, one who is born of a god, the other of a human, or a god and a human. So there's this idea of light and dark with the twins, one of the characters taking on the lighter energy and the other perhaps carrying the heavier energy of the sign. So, Gemini 1, we're going to find out what makes it different from the other two decans is it has different planetary rulers and different tarot cards, etc., associated with it. I'm going to unpack all of that information along with giving you an example of real life embodied energy of Gemini 1 in the life of Margaret Atwood, the famous author who has her rising or ascendant degree in this part of the zodiac and kind of exemplifies the energy. So I hope you enjoy the video. If you do, like and subscribe. It helps people find the content. So we already talked a little bit about the general Gemini energy having to do with communication and ideas and multiplicity of perspectives. Gemini 1, the very first part of the sign, the first 10 degrees, is ruled under the Chaldean order by Jupiter and under the triplicity system by Mercury. When we look at the decans, we always look to see there are always two rulers of the sign under different systems. And the energy of Jupiter is quite different than the energy of Mercury. In fact, they, under ancient Hellenistic astrology, they're understood to be they're sort of opposing signs in the astrological wheel. Mercury always rules the sign that is opposite from the sign that Jupiter rules. So that's how we bring in that idea of them being quite different from each other. Jupiter was Zeus in the pantheon, a big, abundant personality. So there's something about Jupiter, the planet. It's very large, expansive. It brings big ideas. Also, the desire to come up with sort of philosophical explanations and understanding of the world, the desire to come up with maybe a unitary principle that explains life. Jupiter can also have to do with faith. It rules Pisces. And it can have to do with the idea of the quest. It rules Sagittarius. In contrast, we have Mercury, which is this little tiny planet that runs around communicating with the other planets. In ancient Greece mythology, Mercury was Hermes, the little figure that had a wing on his foot who would fly between the underworld and the world and bring messages to the god or to the gods or among the gods. Mercury is swift energy. It's about particular details as opposed to Jupiter, which is about the big idea. And Mercury in Gemini likes to gather information and, as I said, put it out into the world. When we think, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Oh, Mercury's the trickster, right? Hermes loved to play tricks on his older brother Apollo in the Greek myths. And there's something about people with Mercury or Gemini energy where they have this flexibility of thinking, where they love to play games, right? And as well, Mercury can have to do with commerce. Mercury is good at marketing and communicating and sort of it's a keen intellect, let's say, Mercury can bring to someone. if they have it strong in their chart. So let's move on from those planetary rulers, or hold that in the back of our mind as we think about people who have their rising degree or planets in this part of Gemini, and understand in general that they may have a conflict, or both things being present at once. Jupiterian big optimistic energy and Mercurial ideas. What happens when those come together? And we'll see that represented in the tarot card that we discuss in a second. But first, let me read a little passage from Agrippa's book of occult philosophy, where he describes the decan. And in that book, he says, in the first face is another word for decan, of Gemini ascends a man in whose hand is a rod and is, as it were, serving another. This is the face of literature and science and of knowledge, and it confers intelligence and the profession of writing, which is fascinating because the example we're going to use is the very prolific author, Margaret Atwood, who had her rising degree in this part of Gemini. So if we just break that down a little bit, sometimes people with energy in this decan, they may be writers, they may have this capacity to write. Scientists are also can be known for Gemini energy, because Gemini likes to gather facts and details, and that's in part what science does. It observes and records, right? And so that can be the energy of this decan as well. Looking at the tarot cards that are associated with the decan, we start with the Seven of Swords. Whoops, let me see if I can get that out of the light. And we see here a really interesting image. It can look difficult at first when you look at it, but the card is quite complex. So we see a woman with swords around her, but they're not quite blocking her. Swords can have to do with that mental energy. Swords are the sign of, are the element of thinking, that air quality. And we see that she's bound, but if you look closely, the binding is loose. She could wriggle out of that if she wanted to. And we also see that, her feet are not bound and the way is clear forward for her. She could walk out. Now you might say, but she's blindfolded. How can she know where she's going? Well, if you look really closely, one of her eyes is peeking out from underneath the blindfold, right? So there's this idea with the Eight of Swords, of the mind getting overwhelmed by information, right? This fits with Mercury, Jupiter. Mercury's the information. Jupiter is the planet that expands that. So there's this it can be a feeling of too much information, too much being in your head, and that can end up getting you caught in your own mental structures. And also there's a potential to break out of those structures with this card, or with this energy of Gemini 1. So the progression potentially over the course of the life for somebody who has significant placements here, particularly the ascendant, is coming to know or grapple with ideas or questions around the limitations of thought and where we might break free in our thought. One of the answers to that relates to the water we see at the bottom of the card. The woman's foot is in the water, suggesting an access to a standpoint that brings in emotional ideas, and the clarity that can come. I know myself, when I have a lot of Mercury in my chart, by the way, but sometimes my head will get spinning, and you realize, or come to realize, if you do a little bit of inner work, that when our head is spinning off, or perseverating is another word for it, oftentimes it's because there's something emotional that wants to come out and be known, something unknown. And so when we tap into our body and the emotions, something comes up and we get clarity. Right? And so we see that grappling, or the potential for gaining clarity in this card and releasing ourselves of the bonds. The other tarot card that's associated is the Thoth interference card. And again, we see in the swords in this card, and just in the jagged edges of the red, the confusion and conflict that can be created for folks who have points in this part of Gemini, that there can be a little mental confusion and conflict that can come up and overwhelm us or interfere, right? So, taking that imagery, we can also look at the numerology, the number eight, right? The number eight is the number associated with this decan because of the Eight of Pentacles. And we can move on and think about Kabbalah, an ancient Jewish wisdom tradition that had different sephiroth that had to do with it. The Kabbalah has to do with the creative force and how it manifests in life. And the sephiroth that's related to the number eight is called Had. And Had translates to splendor or majesty, and it embodies qualities such as humility and submission, but also a capacity for intellectual rigor. It's associated with the power of acknowledgement and gratitude and reflecting a deeper or a deep inner commitment to one's purpose and to the divine. So here again, we can kind of see the Jupiter Mercury energy playing together, right? Because Jupiter wants to connect with the divine, wants to understand the oneness of the universe, and Mercury is more about the particular. So how can we work with those together to manifest something real in the world? What will it take for us to get mental clarity to be able to articulate the divine in the world? Because eights are about manifestation in the world, along with their partner, the seven, Netzach, in Kabbalah. So there's something about the energy of the eights that wants to bring something divine into the world. So let's take all that information and think about Margaret Atwood and her contribution to society, which, we already talked about the fact that Hod can have to do with some not articulating the divine or articulating some new information in the world, manifesting insights in the material world. And when we reflect on Margaret Atwood's work, in particular her work, The Handmaid's Tale, which was made into a TV series as well, so I think a lot of folks are familiar with the themes there, we can see the Jupiter and Mercury energy playing out, as well as the energy, of course, of this card. She almost looks like a handmaid, right? Wow, that's really striking. I'm not going to lie. So trying to break that down. First, we see a philosophical bent in her writing. She's got an expansive vision. She's trying to synthesize complex ideas. That's what Jupiter does. She has intricate narratives and she tries to address profound societal issues in her work. It's a dystopian tale of the oppression of women. And unfortunately, it's beginning to be mirrored even more closely in recent years, right, in the world. So, um, yeah, so that's the Jupiter side, the capacity to come up with this big story that tells a tale that perhaps changes societal ideas. But then we also bring in the energy of Mercury, and we see her intellectual sharpness and the mastery of language. If you read the book or read any of Margaret Atwood's writings, you can see she's just an amazing writer. Um, and she's able to use that Mercury capacity to communicate those complex Jupiterian ideas, right? And as well, she's got this flexibility around her writing that represents the Gemini energy of multiple perspectives because she not only wrote dystopian fiction, she wrote essays and she even wrote graphic novels. So, this capacity to do more than one thing at once with her energy. One last thing about the Jupiterian energy is it brings optimism. And if you read the books or watch the show, you can see that in the midst of the Handmaid Tale's oppression, there's an optimism that enters in that allows her and the other handmaids to resist the oppressive systems, and that Offred, the main character, as she engages in that resistance, brings in that emotional, watery quality to help sustain her and sustain the other handmaids in the midst of the oppression. So then let's talk also lastly just about how The Handmaid's Tale is reflected in the themes of The Handmaid's Tale in this card. There's a way in which this card, you could take the symbolism here and imagine it being around the oppressive themes, right? The idea that the structures of society, those swords that surround the woman, and and make her feel like she's enclosed, as well as the strictures around her body. Um, that this is represented by the system that is set up in this dystopian novel. And that Margaret Atwood is exploring the idea of breaking free by shining a light on those restrictive systems, right? She has the consciousness to be aware and to present a story that brings to our consciousness the reality of those oppressive systems. And you know what? It might feel like they're blocking us, but hey, we can break free. There are ways through resistance and awareness and tapping into our emotional capacity that we can step out of the things that we imagine are binding us. Yeah, so there's just it's such a rich decan, and I think I'll just repeat some of the earlier ideas that people with energy in this decan, they have such a complex ability, or there's such a complexity to the energy with that expansiveness that can lead to overthinking with the Mercury, but also potentially that Jupiterian energy and the water, the emotions, bring a potential for an optimistic relation, for a gaining of clarity and bringing some new ideas out in the world around the idea of what constricts us mentally. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Again, if you did, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time for Gemini 2.